The whispers cut through the crisp autumn air like a knife as Eleanor Walsh clutched her market basket tighter against her chest. The year was 1876, and Johnson City, Texas, was a town built on cattle drives, cotton, and unfortunate for Eleanor convention. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, pretending not to hear the cruel murmurs that followed her down the dusty main street, though each word stung like hail on bare skin. 25 and still unwed, Mrs. Porter said loudly to Mrs. Abernathy outside the general store. Something's not right about a woman who can't secure a husband. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she maintained her steady pace, the worn soles of her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each determined step. 4 years had passed since she'd buried her father, leaving her to run their modest farm alone. 4 years of backbreaking work, of proving she could survive without a man's protection, of enduring the town's growing disapproval. But today was different. Today the whispers had grown into bold proclamations. My Jeremiah says she turned down 3 perfectly reasonable offers, another woman called out. Pride comes before a fall, as the good book says. Eleanor paused at the butcher's shop, asking Mr. Finley for a small cut of beef cheaper than she would have liked, but it was all she could afford. The drought had been hard on everyone, especially small farmers like herself. Will there be anything else, Miss Walsh? Mr. Finley asked, a note of pity in his voice that somehow felt worse than the outright condemnation from the others. No, thank you, Eleanor replied, maintaining the dignity her father had instilled in her. Just the beef. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with Mayor Thompson and Reverend Phillips, both men stopping their conversation to regard her with obvious disapproval. Miss Walsh, Mayor Thompson said, his voice carrying across the street where a small crowd had begun to gather. The town council has been discussing your situation. Eleanor's stomach twisted. My situation, sir? A woman alone, Reverend Phillips interjected, stroking his gray beard. It isn't proper. It isn't safe. And frankly, it sets a troubling example for the younger ladies of Johnson City. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. I manage my farm adequately, Reverend. I pay my taxes, she said, nodding toward the mayor. I fail to see how my personal circumstances concern the town council. The mayor cleared his throat. Times are changing, Miss Walsh. The railroad will reach us by year's end. Johnson City is growing. We're establishing ourselves as a respectable community, and certain irregularities must be addressed. Irregularities. Eleanor's voice rose slightly, drawing more onlookers. A woman your age, unmarried and living alone, Mayor Thompson continued, seemingly encouraged by the gathering crowd. It's unseemly. The council believes it would be in everyone's best interest, including your own, if you were to either secure a husband promptly or consider selling your property to someone who can manage it properly. The public humiliation was worse than Eleanor could have imagined. Standing in the middle of Johnson City's main street with what felt like every citizen watching, she fought to keep her composure. You have no right, she began, but her voice faltered. We have every right to protect the moral fabric of this community, Reverend Phillips said sternly. A woman needs a husband's guidance. It's God's natural order. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I've managed just fine these past 4 years, Eleanor said, fighting back tears that threatened to fall. My father taught me everything I needed to know about running our farm. And yet your fences are falling down, your crops are failing, and you barely scrape by, said Mrs. Porter loudly. My husband says your property is becoming an eyesore. Eleanor wanted to argue that everyone's crops were suffering in the drought, that she worked from sunrise to sunset every day, that she hadn't asked for her father to die and leave her alone, but the words caught in her throat. "The council is prepared to give you until Christmas to rectify your situation," Mayor Thompson announced, as if conferring a great kindness. "Either find a suitable husband or prepare to sell." The unfairness of it all made Eleanor's chest tighten. She opened her mouth to respond when the crowd suddenly parted, and a tall figure on horseback moved forward. "That's quite enough," came a deep, steady voice that Eleanor didn't recognize. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. Dust coated his worn leather chaps, and his face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't from Johnson City. Eleanor would have remembered someone like him, but something about his confident stance suggested he was no stranger to Texas. "And who might you be?" Mayor Thompson asked, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Jackson Hayes," the stranger replied, removing his hat to reveal sun-bronzed features and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Just arrived from San Antonio way." Eleanor noticed calloused hands and the easy way he carried himself, a working man, not some dandy from back east. A cowboy, by the look of him, probably passing through like so many did on their way to the cattle markets further north. "Well, Mr. Hayes, this is town business," the mayor said dismissively. "Nothing that concerns an outsider." The cowboy's gaze swept over the gathered crowd before settling on Eleanor. She felt an unexpected flush creep up her neck at the directness of his look. There was something in his eyes, not pity, which she'd grown to hate, but something else. Understanding, perhaps. "Seems to me," Jackson Hayes said slowly, "that public humiliation stopped being proper town business somewhere around the Dark Ages." He stepped closer to Eleanor, still addressing the crowd. "Where I come from, a woman working her own land earns respect, not ridicule." Eleanor stared at him, astonished. No one had spoken in her defense in years. "You don't understand our ways here," Reverend Phillips said stiffly. A woman needs what all folks need," Jackson interrupted. "Respect and the freedom to choose her own path." He turned to face Eleanor fully now. "Miss, I don't know you, but I admire your grit. 4 years running a farm alone is no small feat." The unexpected alliance made Eleanor stand straighter. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes, but I doubt your intervention, kind as it is, will change the council's decision." Jackson studied her for a long moment. Then a slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his weathered features. "Maybe this will," he said, and before Eleanor could comprehend what was happening, the cowboy dropped to one knee in the dusty street, taking her free hand in his. "Miss Walsh, you don't know me from Adam, and I don't know much about you except what I've seen here today. But I know courage when I see it, and I know injustice when I hear it." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Eleanor stood frozen, her market basket clutched in one hand, the other held gently in the calloused grip of a complete stranger. "I've been looking to settle somewhere," Jackson continued, his voice steady though his eyes revealed a hint of his own surprise at his actions. "I've got savings from 10 years of cattle drives, and I know farming near as well as ranching." He paused, those storm-gray eyes never leaving hers. "If you'll have me, I'd be proud to call you my wife." The entire street fell silent. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she stared down at the kneeling cowboy. His proposal was madness. They were complete strangers. Yet in that moment, she saw something in his face that spoke of honesty, of decency. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "you don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied simply. "I know you've got more backbone than half the men I've worked with. I know you're facing an impossible choice, not of your making." He lowered his voice so only she could hear. And I know what it's like to be alone in a world that has little patience for those who don't fit neatly into their expectations. Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of stares. This was insanity considering a proposal from a man who'd ridden into town less than an hour ago. Yet what choice did she have? Surrender the land her father had worked his whole life to build. Marry one of the local men who had made their disdain for her independence perfectly clear. "You're serious?" she asked, searching his face for any sign of mockery or deceit. "As a Texas drought," Jackson replied with that same steady gaze. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat loudly. "This is highly irregular, but it would solve your concerns, would it not?" Jackson turned to face the mayor without releasing Eleanor's hand. "Miss Walsh would have a husband, and her property would have a man to manage it properly, as you put it." The mayor sputtered, caught in his own logic. Eleanor's mind raced. This stranger, this Jackson Hayes, was offering her a way out, but at what cost? Marriage wasn't something to enter into lightly. Yet as she looked into his eyes, she didn't see calculation or triumph. She saw sincerity and perhaps a hint of the same desperate determination that had kept her going these past 4 years. "Mr. Hayes," she said finally, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I accept your proposal." A buzz of shocked conversation erupted around them. Jackson rose to his feet, a flash of surprise crossing his features before he regained his composure. "Well then," he said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "I reckon that settles it." Reverend Phillips stepped forward, his expression a mix of confusion and disapproval. "You can't possibly mean to marry a complete stranger, Miss Walsh." "Seems to me," Eleanor replied, finding strength in Jackson's steady presence beside her, "that the council's concerns have been addressed. I will have a husband, and my property will have a man's hand guiding it." She couldn't keep the edge from her voice as she echoed their own words back to them. But the mayor began. "Unless," Jackson interjected smoothly, "the issue wasn't really about propriety at all. Perhaps it was more about certain interested parties hoping to acquire Miss Walsh's land once she was forced to sell." Mayor Thompson's face reddened, confirming Eleanor's long-held suspicions that there was more to the council's sudden interest in her marital status than moral concerns. "The railroad's coming," Jackson continued, "and land values are set to rise. Interesting timing for this sudden concern about Miss Walsh's living arrangements." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, unable to meet Eleanor's gaze now that the unspoken truth had been given voice. "This is outrageous," the mayor blustered. "We only had Miss Walsh's best interests at heart." "Then you'll be pleased that her future is secured," Jackson replied evenly. "When shall we make this official, Reverend Phillips? Tomorrow." "I wouldn't want to delay in putting the good people of Johnson City at ease." The Reverend opened and closed his mouth several times before finally saying, "The church is available at noon." Eleanor felt lightheaded. 24 hours to prepare for a marriage to a man she'd just met. It was madness. "Noon tomorrow it is," Jackson agreed, turning to Eleanor with a softer expression. "If that suits you, Miss Walsh," she nodded, unable to find words. What had she just agreed to? As the crowd began to disperse, some casting curious glances back at the unlikely couple, Jackson spoke quietly. "I meant what I said, every word of it, but I understand if you need time to reconsider." Eleanor studied him, this tall stranger who had upended her life in the span of minutes. "Why did you do this?" she asked. "The truth, please." Jackson's expression grew distant for a moment. "I've seen good people broken by the weight of others' expectations and judgments. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand beside you." He met her eyes again. "I can help you keep your land, and you can help me find a place to put down roots. Beyond that, well, we'd have to figure it out as we go." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even particularly romantic. But it was honest, and after years of facing the town's hypocrisy alone, honesty felt like a gift Eleanor couldn't afford to refuse. "Noon tomorrow, then," she agreed, offering her hand to shake like her father had taught her when sealing a deal. Jackson's weathered hand enveloped hers, warm and strong. "Partners?" he asked. "Partners," Eleanor confirmed, ignoring the flutter in her chest that suggested this arrangement might become more complicated than either of them anticipated. As they walked side by side down the street toward her wagon, Eleanor felt the weight of the town's stairs, but for the first time in years, those stairs didn't cut quite so deep. Whatever came next would be uncertain, but she would face it with an ally at her side. And in the wild lands of Texas, in 1876, allies were sometimes all the difference between survival and surrender. Morning light streamed through the worn curtains of Eleanor's bedroom as she stared at her reflection in the small mirror. Her honey-brown hair was neatly pinned up, and she wore her mother's dress, the only truly fine garment she owned. The ivory fabric had yellowed slightly with age, but the delicate lace at the collar and cuffs remained beautiful. "This is madness," she whispered to herself, smoothing down the front of the dress with trembling hands. Outside, she could hear the chickens clucking in the yard, demanding their morning feed. The familiar sounds of her life continued despite the extraordinary turn of events. In a few hours, she would be married to Jackson Hayes, a man she'd known for less than a day. After leaving town yesterday, they had ridden mostly in silence to her farm. Eleanor had shown him the property, the small two-bedroom house her father had built, the barn in need of repair, the fields that had yielded less and less with each passing season of drought. Jackson had listened, asked intelligent questions, and made no disparaging comments about the obvious state of disrepair that limited resources had forced upon the place. They had spoken awkwardly of practical matters where he would sleep, the second bedroom that had once been her father's, what skills he brought ranching, carpentry, and a knowledge of irrigation techniques from his time in California, and what she expected: help with the heavy work, respect for her knowledge of the farm, and her continued right to make decisions about the property. But they hadn't spoken of other expectations, of what marriage truly meant beyond the legal protection it would provide her. A knock at the front door startled Eleanor from her thoughts. It was still early, barely 7 o'clock. Jackson had left at nightfall, saying he needed to secure lodging in town and would return for the wedding. Who could be calling at this hour? She made her way downstairs, conscious of the unusual swish of her mother's dress against the wooden floor. Opening the door, she was surprised to find Maggie Chen, the daughter of the Chinese laundry owner in Johnson City. "Maggie, what brings you all the way out here so early?" Maggie, a young woman of 20 with intelligent eyes and a quiet strength that Eleanor had always admired, held up a small basket. "I brought you something, for your wedding day." Eleanor ushered her inside, touched by the gesture. Maggie was perhaps the closest thing she had to a friend in Johnson City, though their interactions were limited by the town's disapproval of both women for different reasons. "How did you know? News travels fast, I suppose." Maggie smiled, placing the basket on the kitchen table. "The whole town is talking about nothing else. The mysterious cowboy who proposed to the stubborn spinster in the middle of Main Street." Eleanor winced at the description. "Is that what they're calling me now?" "Among other things," Maggie replied honestly, then softened her tone. "But mostly they're just shocked. No one expected Jackson Hayes to ride into town and turn everything upside down." Eleanor sat down heavily at the table. "I'm still in shock myself." Maggie began unpacking her basket, a small jar of fragrant oil, a comb carved from tortoiseshell, and a delicate hairpin with tiny pearls. "My mother sent these," she explained. "In our tradition, a bride should have something beautiful for her wedding day." She hesitated. "She also said to remind you that marriage to a stranger is not so unusual where she comes from. Arranged marriages can grow into love if both people are willing to nurture it." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. The Chens had faced their own share of prejudice in Johnson City, yet here was Maggie extending kindness when many others had only offered judgment. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know what I'm doing, Maggie." Maggie moved behind her and began gently unpinning Eleanor's simple hairstyle. "You're surviving, just as you have been since your father died." Her nimble fingers worked through Eleanor's hair. "Now, let me help you look like the bride you are." For the next hour, Maggie worked her magic, massaging the fragrant oil into Eleanor's hair, creating an elegant style that framed her face softly, and securing it with the pearl hairpin. "There," Maggie said finally, standing back to admire her work. "You look beautiful." Eleanor touched her hair gently. "It feels strange, to be preparing for a wedding I never expected." "Life rarely follows the path we expect," Maggie replied, wisdom beyond her years in her voice. "My father didn't expect to settle in Texas when he left China. He didn't expect to marry my mother, who was promised to another man but fled on the ship where they met." Eleanor looked at her in surprise. "I never knew that story. People contain multitudes of stories we never hear," Maggie said simply. "Perhaps your Jackson Hayes has his own." "He's not my Jackson Hayes," Eleanor protested. Even as her cheeks warmed, Maggie just smiled knowingly. "Not yet, perhaps." She began repacking her basket. "I should go. My father needs help at the laundry and you have preparations to make." As Eleanor walked her to the door, Maggie paused. "Whatever his reasons for proposing, he stood up for you when no one else would. That says something about his character." After Maggie left, Eleanor returned to her preparations with a slightly lighter heart. She fed the chickens and milked the cow, careful not to dirty her dress. The familiar chores helped settle her nerves, grounding her in the reality of the life she was fighting to preserve. By 10 o'clock, she had finished her morning tasks and was preparing to hitch the wagon for the ride into town when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw Jackson riding toward the farmhouse, leading a second horse, a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her nose. He wore a clean black coat over a crisp white shirt, his usual weathered hat replaced by a newer one. He'd clearly made an effort to look respectable, though Eleanor noticed he still wore his worn leather boots rather than town shoes. Somehow, that small detail reassured her. "Miss Walsh," he called as he approached, dismounting smoothly. "I thought you might appreciate a ride into town." His eyes took in her appearance, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. "You look very fine," he finally managed. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, suddenly shy. "And thank you for the consideration of bringing a horse." Jackson nodded toward the chestnut mare. "This is Sadie. She's gentle but sure-footed. I bought her this morning from the livery." He paused. "I thought you might need your own horse now that we'll be working the farm together." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "You bought me a horse?" "Consider it a wedding gift," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his expression. "Is it suitable?" The mare was beautiful, far nicer than Eleanor could have afforded for herself, and the thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. "It's more than suitable," she said softly. "It's perfect." "But Mr. Hayes, Jackson, please. If we're to be married in 2 hours, we should at least use each other's given names." "Jackson," Eleanor amended, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "This is too generous. Horses are expensive and you hardly know me." He stepped closer, leading Sadie forward. I told you I have savings from my years on cattle drives, and I believe in starting things right. He offered the reins to Eleanor. Besides, a farm needs good horses. As Eleanor reached for the reins, her fingers brushed against Jackson's, and she felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you certain about this?" she asked quietly. "It's not too late to change your mind." Jackson's expression grew serious. "I don't make promises lightly, Eleanor. When I knelt in that street yesterday, I meant what I said." He took a deep breath. "I won't pretend this is a conventional beginning, but I'm committed to making this work for both our sakes." Eleanor studied him, searching for any sign of deception or regret, but found only steady resolve in his gaze. "Then I think we should head to town," she said finally. "It wouldn't do to be late to our own wedding." Jackson's face relaxed into a small smile. "No, it wouldn't." He helped her mount Sadie, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Ready." As they rode side by side toward Johnson City, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of terror and hope. This wasn't the marriage she had dreamed of as a young girl. There had been no courtship, no falling in love, no certainty about their future. But there was respect in the way Jackson looked at her. There was kindness in his actions. And there was the possibility, however slim, that this strange beginning might lead to something neither of them had expected to find in the harsh landscape of West Texas. A true partnership. The church in Johnson City was unnervingly full when Eleanor and Jackson arrived. Word of the unusual engagement had spread like wildfire, drawing townsfolk who rarely attended regular Sunday services. Eleanor felt their stares as Jackson helped her dismount from Sadie, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Quite an audience," he murmured, offering his arm. Eleanor placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, grateful for his solid presence. "They've come for the spectacle, not to offer good wishes." "Then let's give them something to talk about," Jackson replied with a wink that startled a small laugh from her. As they approached the church steps, Mayor Thompson intercepted them, his expression strained. "Miss Walsh, Mr. Hayes, a word before the ceremony, if you please." Jackson's posture stiffened slightly, but his voice remained even. "Of course, Mayor, though I hope this won't delay the proceedings. The Reverend is expecting us." The mayor led them to a small alcove beside the church entrance. "I want to be clear that while the town council cannot legally prevent this hasty union, we have concerns about its legitimacy." "Legitimacy," Eleanor echoed, her cheeks heating with indignation. "A proposal made under such unusual circumstances," Mayor Thompson elaborated. "Between two people who are virtual strangers, it raises questions about motive and sincerity." Jackson's expression darkened. "The only questionable motives I've seen are from those who tried to bully a woman off her rightfully owned property." His voice remained low, but carried an edge that made the mayor take a small step backward. "Our reasons for marrying are our own business." "Nevertheless," the mayor persisted, "Reverend Phillips has insisted that you both affirm in his office before the ceremony that you enter this marriage of your own free will and with honorable intentions." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Jackson. "We have nothing to hide," she said firmly. "Lead the way." In the Reverend's small office, they found not only Reverend Phillips but also Judge Holloway, who presided over the county court. "This is highly irregular," the Reverend began without preamble. "In my 30 years of ministry, I have never performed a ceremony for two people who met mere hours before their engagement." Jackson remained calm. "With all due respect, Reverend, many marriages on the frontier begin with limited acquaintance. Mail-order brides are common enough." "But this is not such an arrangement," Judge Holloway pointed out. "Miss Walsh, Are you being coerced in any way? Yesterday's public proposal came directly after the town council presented you with difficult choices. Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting the judge's gaze directly. The coercion, sir, came from the council's ultimatum, not from Mr. Hayes. He offered me a choice when others were intent on removing all my options. And your intentions toward Miss Walsh? The judge turned to Jackson. You arrived in Johnson City yesterday with no apparent connections or history here. Your sudden desire to marry and settle raises questions. My intentions are honorable, Jackson stated simply. I've spent 10 years on cattle drives, saving my earnings with the aim of settling down. I came to this part of Texas looking for land and opportunity. He glanced at Eleanor. I found both, along with a woman of remarkable courage and determination. Something in his steady voice made Eleanor's heart beat faster, though she knew he was largely performing for their audience. And you, Miss Walsh, Reverend Phillips pressed. You enter this marriage willingly, understanding the sacred vows you will take before God. Eleanor took a deep breath. I do. Mr. Hayes and I have discussed our arrangement honestly. We both understand what we're agreeing to. The Reverend and Judge exchanged looks, clearly unsatisfied but finding no legitimate grounds to interfere. Very well, Reverend Phillips said finally. We will proceed with the ceremony. But know that marriage is a sacred covenant, not a business arrangement or a convenient solution to worldly problems. We understand the seriousness of the commitment, Jackson assured him, and we appreciate your concern. As they left the office to enter the church sanctuary, Jackson leaned close to Eleanor. Are you still certain? He whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This was happening. In minutes, she would be Mrs. Jackson Hayes. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Eleanor was acutely aware of the packed pews, of the whispers that rippled through the congregation as she and Jackson stood before the altar. She heard Reverend Phillips speak of duty and fidelity, of lifelong commitment and God's design for marriage. When the time came to exchange vows, Jackson's voice was clear and steady, his eyes never leaving hers as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her until death parted them. The words were traditional, expected, but something in his gaze made Eleanor wonder if he might actually mean them someday. Her own voice trembled slightly as she repeated the same promises, the enormity of what they were doing finally hitting her full force. This wasn't just about keeping her land or satisfying the town's demands for propriety. This was a life-altering commitment to a man she barely knew. The rings. Reverend Phillips prompted. Eleanor froze. In all the chaos, she hadn't even thought about wedding rings, but Jackson reached into his pocket and produced 2 simple gold bands. I got these this morning, he explained quietly to her questioning look. As he slid the smaller ring onto her finger, his hands were gentle, his touch sending an unexpected warmth through her. When it was her turn to place the larger band on his finger, Eleanor noticed a slight tremor in his hand, the first sign that perhaps Jackson Hayes wasn't as unaffected by their unusual situation as his confident demeanor suggested. By the authority vested in me, Reverend Phillips intoned, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He paused, looking between them with lingering doubt. You may kiss your bride. Eleanor's breath caught. They hadn't discussed this part. Jackson's eyes asked a silent question as he leaned toward her. Eleanor gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and his lips touched hers gently, briefly, but with enough warmth to send her heart racing. It was her first kiss, over almost before it began, yet somehow it left her dizzy. I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Jackson Hayes, Reverend Phillips announced to the congregation, his tone suggesting he still had reservations about the union he'd just solemnized. As they turned to face the assembled townsfolk, Eleanor was struck by the variety of expressions that greeted them: curiosity, skepticism, disapproval, and from a few like Maggie Chen and her family, genuine well wishes. Mayor Thompson looked distinctly displeased, confirming Eleanor's suspicion that he'd had designs on her property once she was forced to sell. Outside the church, they were met with a smattering of half-hearted congratulations from people who clearly attended more out of curiosity than genuine support. Jackson kept a protective hand at the small of Eleanor's back, steering her through the crowd with quiet authority. "Mrs. Hayes," came a voice from behind them. Eleanor turned to find Mrs. Porter, one of her most vocal critics, approaching with a fixed smile. "What an unusual wedding. I do hope you'll be happy." The insincerity in her tone was unmistakable. "Thank you, Mrs. Porter," Eleanor replied with equal insincerity. "How kind of you to take such an interest in my personal affairs." Before the older woman could respond, Jackson smoothly interjected, "My wife and I appreciate your good wishes. If you'll excuse us, we have much to do today." "Wife." The word sounded strange, applied to her. Eleanor felt Jackson's hand press gently against her back, guiding her toward their horses. "I hope you don't mind," he said quietly as they left the crowd behind, "but I took the liberty of arranging a small celebration at the hotel restaurant. Nothing elaborate, just a proper meal to mark the occasion." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "That's thoughtful but unnecessary." "Maybe," Jackson conceded, "but a wedding day should include at least some happiness, don't you think?" There was something vulnerable in his expression that made Eleanor soften. "Yes," she agreed. "It should." The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Johnson City, a place Eleanor had rarely entered, given her limited finances. The manager, Mr. Burkhart, greeted them with considerably more warmth than most of the wedding guests had shown. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," he said, leading them to a corner table adorned with a small vase of wildflowers. "Your table is ready." As they settled in, Eleanor noticed the curious glances from other diners. "We're still the main attraction, it seems," she murmured. "Let them look," Jackson replied, unfazed. "By next week, there'll be some new scandal to occupy them." A waiter brought them each a glass of wine, a luxury Eleanor hadn't enjoyed since before her father's death. "To new beginnings," Jackson said, raising his glass. Eleanor touched her glass to his. "To unlikely partnerships." As they sipped their wine, an awkward silence fell between them. They were husband and wife now, yet still virtually strangers. "Tell me about yourself," Eleanor said finally. "The real story, not the version you gave the judge." Jackson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." He set down his glass. "I was born in Virginia. My father was a blacksmith, my mother a schoolteacher. They died of fever when I was 16, and I headed west with nothing but my father's pocket watch and a determination not to end up working in the coal mines." "I'm sorry about your parents," Eleanor said softly. "It was a long time ago," Jackson replied, though something in his eyes suggested the wound wasn't entirely healed. "I worked ranches in Kansas, Oklahoma, and finally Texas. Learned the cattle business from the ground up. Spent the last decade on drives from South Texas to the railheads in Kansas." "And now," Eleanor prompted. "Now I'm 31 and tired of sleeping under the stars with only my horse for company." His expression grew reflective. "A man starts thinking about roots, about building something that lasts." "So you decided to propose to the first spinster in distress you encountered." The words came out sharper than Eleanor intended. Rather than taking offense, Jackson chuckled. "Not exactly, but when I saw what was happening in the street yesterday." It reminded me of something my mother used to say. Sometimes the right path is the one you never expected to take. Their food arrived tender steaks, potatoes, and fresh vegetables that made Eleanor realize how sparse her own meals had been lately. "What about you?" Jackson asked as they began to eat. "Your father taught you farming, but what else should I know about my new wife, my new wife?" The phrase sent another flutter through Eleanor's chest. "I was born on that farm," she began. "My mother died when I was 10 consumption. My father never remarried. He taught me everything: reading, arithmetic, farming, even basic carpentry." A fond smile touched her lips at the memories. He believed a woman should be able to fend for herself, even if convention disagreed. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Eleanor agreed. "When he died a fall from the barn roof during repairs, I thought I could continue as he taught me, and I did for a while. But the drought came, and then—" She gestured vaguely. "Well, you saw how the town feels about a woman managing on her own." Jackson's expression darkened. "I've never understood why people can't mind their own business." "That's not how small towns work," Eleanor said with a wry smile. "Everyone's business is everyone's business." As they finished their meal, the conversation flowed more easily. Eleanor learned that Jackson could read and write well, had a knack for figures, and harbored a particular fondness for horses. He discovered her love of books, her skill with medicinal herbs, and her stubborn determination to succeed against odds that would have defeated many. By the time they left the restaurant, the awkwardness between them had eased somewhat, replaced by a tentative camaraderie that offered Eleanor a glimmer of hope for their unusual arrangement. Outside, Jackson retrieved their horses. "I have a few supplies to collect from the general store before we head back to the farm," he said. "Things we'll need for the repairs I noticed yesterday." "We should stop by the land office as well," Eleanor suggested, "to register our marriage and update the property records." Jackson nodded. "Good thinking." As they walked their horses down Main Street, Eleanor was keenly aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. But with Jackson beside her, they seemed less pointed, less able to wound. At the general store, Mr. Tanner greeted them with professional courtesy, if not warmth. "Congratulations on your marriage," he said, the words sounding rehearsed. "Thank you," Jackson replied easily. "We'll need these items." He handed over a list he'd prepared. As Mr. Tanner gathered the supplies, Mrs. Abernathy entered the store, her eyes widening at the sight of the newlyweds. "Well, if it isn't the happy couple," she said, her tone suggesting she believed they were anything but. "Such a whirlwind romance. One might almost think it was a marriage of convenience rather than affection." Eleanor tensed, but before she could respond, Jackson placed a hand lightly on her waist and smiled at Mrs. Abernathy. "You know, madam, where I come from, folks consider it good luck to find love unexpectedly." His tone was pleasant, but his eyes held a warning. "And extremely bad manners to question another couple's feelings." Mrs. Abernathy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and Eleanor had to suppress a smile at her speechlessness. As they left the store with their supplies, Eleanor murmured, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" Jackson asked innocently, loading the purchases onto his horse. "Defend our romance," Eleanor clarified. "We both know this is an arrangement of mutual benefit." Jackson paused, turning to face her fully. "Eleanor, I may not have known you long, but I respect you, and I won't stand by while others try to diminish you or us." His expression softened. "Besides, who's to say what this might become with time?" The simple statement, delivered without pretense, made Eleanor's cheeks warm again. She looked away, unsure how to respond to the implication that their marriage might grow into something more than a practical solution. At the land office, they found Mr. Simmons, a balding man with spectacles who managed the county records. He recorded their marriage certificate and updated the property deed to reflect their joint ownership. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes," he said, using Eleanor's new name for the first time in an official capacity. "I must say, this resolves certain concerns the council had raised about your property." "How convenient," Eleanor replied dryly. As they prepared to leave, Mr. Simmons cleared his throat. "Actually, there is one other matter, the property taxes." Eleanor froze. The taxes weren't due for another month, and she had been desperately trying to save enough to cover them. "What about them?" Jackson asked. "Well, given the change in ownership, we could process the payment now if you wish," Mr. Simmons suggested. "It would simplify matters." Eleanor understood the implication. The council still doubted the legitimacy of their marriage and was testing whether Jackson would actually assume the financial responsibilities that came with the property. Before she could speak, Jackson was removing his wallet from his coat pocket. "How much is owed?" Mr. Simmons named a sum that made Eleanor wince internally. It was more than she had managed to save, and she hadn't intended to burden Jackson with this expense so immediately. "Jackson," she began quietly, "we don't need to," but he was already counting out the money. "Consider it settled," he told Mr. Simmons, who looked slightly disappointed as he wrote out the receipt. Outside, Eleanor turned to him, troubled. "You shouldn't have done that. I wasn't expecting you to pay the taxes so soon." "It needed to be done," Jackson replied simply. "And it sends a message that we're serious about this partnership." "I'll repay you," Eleanor insisted, "once the farm is producing properly again." Jackson studied her face. "Eleanor, when I proposed, I meant to share everything, responsibilities as well as benefits. Your burdens are now our burdens." He smiled slightly. "Besides, what else was I saving for all these years if not to build a life somewhere?" The sincerity in his voice silenced her protests. This man, her husband of mere hours, had just paid a substantial sum without hesitation to secure her property. Their property, now. As they mounted their horses to return to the farm, their home, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of emotions. Gratitude, certainly. Confusion about the strange path her life had taken. And something else, something unexpected. A fluttering hope that perhaps this hasty marriage might become more than just an arrangement of convenience. The sun was setting as they rode back to the farm, casting long shadows across the dusty road. Eleanor glanced at the man riding beside her, Jackson Hayes, her husband, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. The first weeks of marriage were a curious dance of navigation, two strangers learning to share a life, a home, a purpose. Eleanor and Jackson established an unspoken routine, careful to respect each other's space and privacy, while gradually building a working partnership that surprised them both with its efficiency. Jackson slept in the second bedroom as they had agreed, and they maintained a careful politeness that sometimes felt more like that of boarding house residents than husband and wife. Yet beneath the formality, Eleanor sensed a growing ease between them. Each morning, they shared breakfast at the kitchen table, discussing the day's tasks and longer-term plans for the farm. Jackson proved to be not only knowledgeable but thoughtful in his approach, never dismissing Eleanor's experience or insights. "The south field has better drainage," she explained over coffee one morning, about 2 weeks after their wedding. "But the soil in the north field retains moisture better during dry spells." Jackson nodded, making notes in a small ledger he had purchased for tracking the farm's operations. "What if we divided our planting? Use the south field for crops that need less water, save the north field for those that need more consistent moisture." Eleanor considered the suggestion. "That could work. Father always planted the same way his father had, but with the changing weather patterns. "Worth trying, at least," Jackson said, not pushing but offering the idea for her consideration. "Your experience with this land counts for more than any theory I might have." These small moments, the respectful exchanges, the blending of their knowledge gradually transformed the awkward arrangement into a true partnership. Eleanor found herself watching Jackson as he worked, admiring not just his physical strength as he repaired fences and shored up the sagging barn roof, but the careful way he approached each task, the respect he showed for her father's workmanship even as he improved upon it. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the wedding, Eleanor brought water to where Jackson was digging irrigation channels in the north field, implementing the plan they had discussed. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and he had a smudge of dirt across his forehead where he had wiped away perspiration. "Thank you," he said, accepting the dipper and drinking deeply. "This soil is promising. With proper irrigation, we could double the yield from last year." "If the rain comes," Eleanor cautioned, shading her eyes against the sun as she surveyed the cloudless sky. "Even if it doesn't," Jackson replied. "That's the beauty of these channels. They'll direct what water we do get exactly where it's needed with less waste." He pointed to the pattern he was creating. "I saw a similar system in California once. Mexican farmers had been using it for generations." Eleanor studied the channels with growing interest. "Show me how it works." Jackson's face lit up at her question, and he spent the next hour explaining the principles behind the irrigation system, demonstrating how the water would flow, where it would pool, how it would reach the roots most efficiently. As the sun began to set, they walked back to the house together, discussing possibilities and improvements with an easy back and forth that felt natural in a way Eleanor hadn't expected. "You're good at this," she said suddenly. "Digging ditches?" Jackson asked with a wry smile. "Farming," Eleanor clarified. "You understand it. I thought you were a cattleman." Jackson shrugged. "My family had a small farm back in Virginia before." He trailed off. "Anyway, I've worked all kinds of land over the years, picked up knowledge where I could." Eleanor sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. They were still learning when to push and when to let things rest between them. That evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, watching fireflies begin to appear in the gathering dusk, Eleanor felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. The farm was still struggling, the drought still threatened, and their marriage remained an unusual arrangement, but for the first time since her father's death, she wasn't facing these challenges alone. "Penny for your thoughts," Jackson said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Eleanor smiled. "I was just thinking that for a marriage that began as a scandal, ours seems to be working surprisingly well." Jackson chuckled, the sound warm in the evening air. "I suppose it is at that." He glanced at her. "Any regrets?" The question was light, but Eleanor heard the genuine inquiry beneath it. "No," she answered honestly. "Do you?" Jackson shook his head, his gaze returning to the darkening fields. "None." A week later, their peaceful routine was interrupted by an unexpected visit. Eleanor was in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for the stew she was making for supper, when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Looking out the window, she recognized Mayor Thompson's carriage, accompanied by 2 riders, Reverend Phillips and Judge Holloway. "Jackson," she called, her stomach tightening with apprehension. "We have visitors." Jackson came in from the barn where he had been repairing a harness. Seeing her expression, he moved to the window and frowned at the approaching party. "Interesting timing," he remarked. "I just finished repainting the south fence yesterday. The property hasn't looked this good in years." "You think they're checking up on us?" Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Jackson nodded. "Let's find out what they want." They stepped onto the porch together as the carriage and riders reached the house. Mayor Thompson's expression was difficult to read as he descended from the carriage, but there was no mistaking the scrutiny in his gaze as he surveyed the property. "Mayor Thompson," Jackson greeted him neutrally. "Reverend Judge, what brings you all the way out here?" "A welfare check, Mr. Hayes," the mayor replied. "The town council remains concerned about Miss Walsh's, pardon me, Mrs. Hayes's situation." "My situation is excellent, thank you," Eleanor said coolly. "As you can see, the farm is thriving under our joint care." It wasn't an exaggeration. In the month since their wedding, Jackson had repaired fences, reinforced the barn, implemented the new irrigation system, and replanted the fields with a more drought-resistant crop selection. The property looked better than it had in years. "Yes, we can see there have been improvements," Mayor Thompson acknowledged reluctantly, "but our concern extends beyond the physical state of the property." "What my colleague means," Judge Holloway interjected, "is that there were questions about the authenticity of your marriage arrangement." Eleanor felt Jackson tense beside her. "Our marriage certificate is properly filed at the county office," he said evenly. "The property deed reflects our legal union. I'm not sure what authenticity you're questioning." Reverend Phillips stepped forward. "A marriage is more than legal documents, Mr. Hayes. It is a sacred covenant before God." "When I expressed reservations about performing your ceremony, it was because I feared you were entering into this union for worldly reasons rather than the joining of two hearts as the Lord intended." "With all due respect, Reverend," Eleanor said, struggling to keep her voice level, "the state of our hearts is between us and God, not subject to committee review." "Nevertheless," Mayor Thompson pressed, "certain concerns have been raised. There are those who believe this marriage was arranged solely to circumvent the council's legitimate concerns about an unmarried woman managing property alone." "And if it was?" Jackson asked, his tone deceptively mild. "The law doesn't require couples to be madly in love before they wed." "Many marriages begin as practical arrangements." "Indeed," Judge Holloway agreed, "but those arrangements typically involve the families on both sides, proper courtship periods, and community oversight." Eleanor's patience snapped. "Community oversight? Is that what you call publicly humiliating me in the street and demanding I either marry or surrender my property? If that's how Johnson City oversees its unmarried women, perhaps the state authorities would be interested in reviewing your methods." The three men looked taken aback by her directness. "Mrs. Hayes," Mayor Thompson began in a patronizing tone, "there's no need for such hostility. We're merely ensuring that all is well." "All is well," Jackson confirmed firmly. "My wife and I are working hard to improve this farm, and we're succeeding. I'm not entirely clear on what gives the town council authority to evaluate our marriage, but I can assure you that we're content with our arrangement." Something in his steady tone must have conveyed his growing irritation, because Judge Holloway raised a placating hand. "No one is suggesting impropriety, Mr. Hayes. But you must understand the unusual circumstances." "The circumstances," Jackson interrupted, "were created by your counsel's ultimatum to my wife. We've resolved the situation legally and to our mutual satisfaction. Unless you have a specific legal concern to raise, I believe we've addressed your questions adequately." The three men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected such a unified front. "Well," Reverend Phillips said finally, "we're pleased to see the property being properly maintained. That was, after all, one of our primary concerns." "Your concern is noted," Eleanor replied, not bothering to hide her skepticism about their motives. As the visitors prepared to leave, Mayor Thompson paused. "The Harvest Festival is next month. As property owners, you're expected to contribute, of course. Of course, Jackson agreed smoothly. We'll be there. After they had gone, Eleanor let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was intrusive, presumptuous, downright rude. Jackson supplied, his expression darkening. All of the above, Eleanor agreed, though I suspect their real purpose was to see if our marriage was showing signs of strain they could exploit. Jackson nodded grimly. Mayor Thompson seemed particularly disappointed to find the farm improved. I wonder if he had hopes of acquiring it himself once you were forced to sell. It wouldn't surprise me, Eleanor said, moving back toward the kitchen where her half-prepared vegetables awaited. He's been buying up land all around the county, especially parcels near where the railroad is expected to run. Jackson followed her inside, leaning against the doorframe as she resumed her work. We handled them well together, he observed. Eleanor glanced up, caught by something in his tone. Yes, she agreed. We did. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, almost like a real married couple. The comment hung in the air between them, acknowledging the peculiar nature of their relationship, while simultaneously suggesting that perhaps it was becoming less peculiar with each passing day. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm as she returned her attention to the vegetables. The stew will be ready in an hour, she said, changing the subject. Will you be finished with the harness by then? I will, Jackson replied, and if he noticed her deflection, he didn't comment on it. Call me when it's ready. As he headed back to the barn, Eleanor found herself watching him go, struck by the realization that in just a month, this man had become an integral part of her life in ways that went beyond their legal arrangement. He was her partner in the truest sense of the word, supporting her dreams for the farm, respecting her knowledge, adding his own skills without diminishing hers. And if sometimes she found herself wondering what it might be like if theirs were a real marriage in every sense, well, that was a thought she kept carefully to herself. The Harvest Festival in Johnson City was the social event of the autumn season. Held in the town square, it brought together farmers, merchants, and townsfolk for a day of celebration, competition, and community bonding. In years past, Eleanor had attended alone, enduring the pitying glances and whispered comments as she presented her modest harvest for judging. This year would be different. Standing beside Jackson in their wagon as they approached the town, Eleanor felt a mixture of nervousness and pride. The back of the wagon was loaded with their contributions: sacks of grain, vegetables from their garden, preserves Eleanor had prepared, and a small barrel of cider from the apple trees at the far end of their property. Nervous? Jackson asked quietly, noticing her tense posture. A little, Eleanor admitted. This will be our first public appearance in town since those men came to the farm. Jackson reached across the wagon seat to cover her hand with his. We'll face it together, just like we did then. The simple touch and the quiet assurance in his voice steadied her. Over the past 2 months, such small moments of physical contact had become more frequent between them, a hand at the small of her back, fingers brushing as they passed tools to each other, sitting shoulder to shoulder on the porch in the evenings. Nothing improper, nothing that crossed the boundaries of their arrangement, but each touch seemed to chip away at the careful distance they had maintained at first. As they entered the town square, Eleanor was acutely aware of the attention they attracted. Conversations paused as people turned to watch them pass. Some nodded in greeting, others whispered behind their hands. Quite the reception, Jackson murmured wryly. They're waiting to see if we'll fall apart in public, Eleanor replied. Or perhaps hoping to spot signs that our marriage is a sham. Jackson's expression hardened slightly. Then let's disappoint them. They pulled the wagon to a stop near the area designated for farm produce judging. As Jackson helped Eleanor down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary, she caught sight of Mayor Thompson watching them with narrowed eyes from across the square. "We have an audience," she whispered. "Good," Jackson replied, and before Eleanor could react, he bent and placed a quick, gentle kiss on her cheek. "Let them talk." Eleanor's surprise must have shown on her face because Jackson added quietly, "Too much." "No," she managed, her cheek tingling where his lips had touched. "Just unexpected." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "We are married, after all." Together, they unloaded their harvest offerings, arranging them for the judge's inspection. Eleanor couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as she surveyed their contributions, tangible proof of what they had accomplished together in just a few short months. "Eleanor." She turned to find Maggie Chen approaching, her arms laden with brightly colored fabric for her family's booth. "Maggie, it's good to see you," Eleanor greeted her warmly. "You remember my husband, Jackson?" "Of course," Maggie replied with a smile. "The whole town is still talking about your dramatic proposal, Mr. Hayes." Jackson chuckled. "Please call me Jackson." "And I hope they've found more interesting topics of conversation by now." "Some have," Maggie admitted, "but many are quite interested to see you both today." She lowered her voice. "Especially after Mayor Thompson's visit to your farm. He returned quite disgruntled that he found nothing amiss." "Did he now?" Jackson's expression was one of mock innocence. "How disappointing for him." Maggie glanced between them, her perceptive eyes noting something that made her smile widen. "Well, you both look well. Marriage seems to agree with you." Before Eleanor could respond to this observation, they were interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Phillips, who was serving as one of the harvest judges. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," he greeted them, his tone carefully neutral as he surveyed their offerings. "An impressive display for your first harvest as a couple." "Thank you, Reverend," Jackson replied. "We've been blessed with good results despite the dry season." "Indeed." The Reverend examined their produce with a critical eye. "Your irrigation methods must be effective." "Several farmers mentioned you've implemented some new techniques." Eleanor nodded. "Jackson brought knowledge from his travels that has proven very valuable. We're happy to share what we've learned with our neighbors." Something in Reverend Phillips's expression softened slightly. "That's commendable. Community support is essential out here." As he moved on to the next display, Eleanor and Jackson exchanged a glance. It was a small interaction, but it felt like progress the first time someone from the town's leadership had acknowledged them with something other than suspicion. The day progressed with competitions, music, and the sharing of food. Eleanor found herself gradually relaxing as they moved through the festival, particularly when several farmers approached Jackson to discuss his irrigation methods. Though some townspeople still watched them with curiosity or skepticism, others seemed to be accepting their presence as a married couple. "Mrs. Hayes," Mrs. Porter called as Eleanor passed the quilting display. "A moment, if you please." Eleanor braced herself, remembering how vocal this woman had been in criticizing her unmarried status. "Yes, Mrs. Porter." To her surprise, the older woman's expression wasn't hostile. "Your preserves won second place in the judging," she said, indicating the display where a red ribbon had been placed beside Eleanor's jars of preserved peaches. "The judges were particularly impressed with your use of cinnamon." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, genuinely pleased despite her wariness. "It was my mother's recipe." Mrs. Porter nodded, then hesitated as if choosing her words carefully. "I understand you've had some success with that new irrigation system your husband implemented." "We have," Eleanor confirmed, noting the woman's use of your husband without any trace of the skepticism that had colored previous references to her marriage. My Thomas is struggling with our south field, Mrs. Porter admitted. The well is running low and we're losing crops. Do you think? Would Mr. Hayes be willing to take a look, offer some advice? The request, coming from someone who had been among her harshest critics, took Eleanor aback. I'm sure he would, she said after a moment. We're neighbors, after all. Something like relief crossed Mrs. Porter's face. Thank you. That's very neighborly of you both. As the woman walked away, Eleanor stood in surprised silence. It seemed their successful harvest and Jackson's farming innovations had begun to earn them a measure of respect that transcended the gossip about their hasty marriage. Later, as the sun began to set and lanterns were lit around the square, music started up for dancing. Eleanor stood watching couples take their places, a wistful feeling stealing over her. She hadn't danced since before her father's death. Would you care to dance, Mrs. Hayes? She turned to find Jackson beside her, hand outstretched, a question in his eyes. Yes, she replied, placing her hand in his. I would like that. He led her to the area where couples were forming lines for a country dance. As they took their positions, Eleanor was acutely aware of the eyes upon them, the first public display of their relationship beyond simple practicality. Everyone's watching, she murmured as they waited for the music to begin. Let them, Jackson replied, his eyes never leaving hers. I'm only interested in dancing with my wife. The simple statement, delivered with such quiet sincerity, made Eleanor's heart skip. As the fiddles began and they moved through the steps of the dance, she found herself forgetting the onlookers, caught up in the unexpected joy of the moment. Jackson proved to be a capable dancer, guiding her through the patterns with confident hands. When the dance called for them to come together, his arm around her waist felt strong and secure. Each time their eyes met during the figures of the dance, Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with exertion. When the music ended, Jackson kept hold of her hand as they left the dance area. Thank you, he said softly, for dancing with you. Eleanor asked, confused by his gratitude. For taking a chance on a stranger who proposed in the middle of the street, he clarified, his expression suddenly serious. I know our arrangement began as a solution to a problem, but... He paused, seeming to search for words when they were interrupted by Judge Holloway. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, the judge said, approaching with an expression that suggested he had news to deliver. A word, if you please. Eleanor felt Jackson's hand tighten slightly around hers as they faced the judge. Of course, Jackson replied, his tone neutral. I wanted to inform you personally, Judge Holloway began, that the town council met yesterday regarding the concerns that were raised about your property and marriage. Eleanor tensed, preparing herself for more intrusion or demands. The council has voted to dismiss those concerns as resolved, the judge continued, surprising them both. Your property is clearly being well maintained, your taxes are paid, and your marriage appears. He hesitated. Substantive. Eleanor blinked in surprise. Thank you for informing us, Judge. The judge nodded stiffly. Mayor Thompson asked me to convey that the council considers the matter closed. His expression suggested that perhaps the mayor hadn't been entirely pleased with this outcome. After the judge moved on, Eleanor turned to Jackson with wide eyes. Did that just happen? Jackson's mouth curved into a smile. It seems we've passed their inspection. Substantive, Eleanor repeated, half laughing at the judge's choice of word. Our marriage is officially substantive enough for Johnson City's standards. Well, Jackson said, his expression growing thoughtful, it is substantive in many ways, isn't it? We work the farm together. We share meals and conversation. We face challenges as partners. He paused, something shifting in his gaze. The only way it isn't substantive is He stopped abruptly, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm as she realized what he had been about to say. The one aspect of marriage they had carefully avoided was physical intimacy. Their arrangement had never included that expectation, and neither had raised the subject in the months they had lived as husband and wife. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. "It's getting late," Eleanor said finally, breaking the tension. "We should start for home if we want to arrive before full dark." Jackson nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll get the wagon." As they drove home under a sky filled with stars, Eleanor found her thoughts returning to the moment on the dance floor, to the feel of Jackson's hand at her waist, to the unfinished statement that hung between them now. Their marriage had begun as a solution to a problem, a business arrangement between strangers. But somewhere in the past few months, as they worked side by side rebuilding her father's farm, as they shared meals and stories and dreams for the future, something had changed. Eleanor stole a glance at Jackson's profile in the moonlight. His expression was contemplative, his hands steady on the reins. This man who had appeared in her life so unexpectedly had become essential to it in ways she hadn't anticipated. And for the first time since their hasty wedding, Eleanor found herself wondering what it might be like if their marriage became truly substantive in every sense of the word. Winter settled over the Texas landscape, bringing shorter days and chilly nights that required fires in both the kitchen stove and the small fireplace in the front room. The change in season brought a shift in their work rhythms, less time in the fields, more focus on repairs, planning, and indoor tasks that had been neglected during the busy harvest. It also brought a shift in Eleanor and Jackson's relationship, though neither acknowledged it directly. The Harvest Festival had marked a turning point, cracking open a door that both had carefully kept closed. Now, small changes accumulated day by day, lingering glances across the dinner table, hands touching longer than necessary when passing tools or dishes, conversations that stretched late into the evening as they sat before the fire. One particularly cold evening in early December, they sat side by side on the small sofa Eleanor's father had built, poring over seed catalogs and planning the spring planting. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the house, but inside was warmth and comfort and the quiet companionship they had grown to value. "The drought might continue into spring," Jackson said, making notes in his ledger. "We should expand the irrigation system to the west field." Eleanor nodded, leaning closer to examine the catalog he was marking. "And perhaps try this new variety of corn. It's supposed to require less water." She was acutely aware of his nearness, of the solid warmth of his shoulder against hers, of the clean scent of soap that always lingered about him after his evening wash. These moments of closeness had become both precious and painful, a reminder of the growing feelings she harbored for her husband and the uncertainty about whether he shared them. "Eleanor," Jackson said suddenly, his voice low and serious, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." She looked up, finding him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes, these past months." He began, then paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Our arrangement has worked well, I think. The farm is thriving. We work well together." "We do," she agreed, wondering where this was leading. Jackson set aside the catalog, turning to face her more directly. "When I proposed to you that day in town, it was an impulsive act driven by a sense of injustice and, I admit, a desire to put down roots somewhere after years of wandering." Eleanor nodded, remembering that strange, fateful day that had changed both their lives. "But these months with you—" He hesitated, his usually confident manner giving way to a vulnerability she rarely saw. "They've become more than I expected. You've become more." Eleanor's heart began to race. "What are you saying, Jackson?" "I'm saying that what began as an arrangement, a partnership of convenience, has become something else for me." His gaze held hers steadily. "I find myself thinking of you not just as my partner in managing this farm, but as my wife in every sense. I find myself wanting more." The directness of his admission made Eleanor's cheeks flush. "More." Jackson reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "I want a real marriage, Eleanor. Not just in name, not just on paper, but in truth. I want to share your bed as well as your life." His voice softened. "But only if that's what you want too." The words she had longed to hear but hadn't dared hope for hung in the air between them. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, gathering her courage. "When did you know," she asked quietly, "that your feelings had changed?" A small smile touched Jackson's lips. "I think it started the day you showed me how to use that herb poultice on Sadie's cut leg. You were so gentle with her, so knowledgeable. I remember watching your hands work and thinking how remarkable you were." He paused. "But I knew for certain at the Harvest Festival, when we danced. Holding you felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering." The simple poetry of his words touched something deep within Eleanor. "I was afraid," she admitted, "that I was the only one whose feelings had grown beyond our arrangement, that perhaps you were content with things as they were." Jackson's hand tightened on hers. "I've been anything but content, Eleanor. Each night, saying goodnight at your bedroom door has become harder than the last." Eleanor raised her eyes to meet his, seeing in them a reflection of her own longing. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "you should stop saying goodnight at the door." For a moment, Jackson remained perfectly still, searching her face as if to confirm he had heard correctly. Then slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss began gently, almost tentatively, but as Eleanor responded, it deepened into something more urgent. Jackson's hand came up to cradle her cheek, and Eleanor found herself leaning into his touch, years of loneliness and months of growing attraction culminating in this moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unevenly. Jackson rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "Eleanor Hayes," he murmured, "I believe I'm falling in love with my wife." The admission, so simply stated yet carrying the weight of transformation, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "And I with my husband," she whispered back. That night, for the first time, Jackson didn't stop at Eleanor's bedroom door. Instead, with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes, he crossed the threshold that had separated them for months, closing the distance not just between their bodies, but between the arrangement they had begun with, and the true marriage they both now desired. As winter gave way to spring, Eleanor and Jackson's relationship blossomed alongside the Texas wildflowers that dotted their fields. The awkwardness that had characterized their early days together was replaced by an easy intimacy, a deep understanding that extended from their work on the farm to the private moments they shared. Their expanded irrigation system proved its worth as the drought indeed continued, allowing their crops to flourish while neighboring farms struggled. True to his word at the Harvest Festival, Jackson shared his knowledge freely with other farmers, including Mr. Porter, who grudgingly admitted the effectiveness of the techniques. As their first anniversary approached in early summer, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the extraordinary year that had passed. What had begun as a desperate solution to an impossible situation had transformed into the kind of partnership and love she had never dared hope for. One warm June morning, Eleanor awoke feeling unusually queasy. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Jackson, and made her way to the wash basin. The nausea passed quickly, as it had for the past few mornings, but a suspicion was growing in her mind. Later that day, as she tended the kitchen garden while Jackson repaired a fence in the north field, Maggie Chen arrived with a basket of fabrics and notions from her family's store. "Eleanor," she called, dismounting from her horse. "I brought those dress patterns you asked about." Eleanor greeted her friend warmly. Over the past year, her friendship with Maggie had deepened, unfettered by the town's previous disapproval of both women. "You're looking well," Maggie observed as they settled on the porch with glasses of cool water. "Marriage continues to agree with you, I see." Eleanor smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Yes, it does." Maggie studied her face for a moment, then her eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Eleanor Walsh Hayes," she said in a hushed tone. "Are you with child?" Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her stomach. "I'm not certain yet," she admitted, "but I suspect." Maggie's face split into a wide smile. "Have you told Jackson?" "Not yet. I wanted to be sure." Eleanor glanced toward the north field where she could just make out Jackson's figure. "It seems almost too perfect after everything." "Life has a way of surprising us," Maggie said, reaching out to squeeze Eleanor's hand. "Sometimes even with the things we most desire." That evening, after supper, Eleanor and Jackson took their usual walk around the property, surveying the day's progress and planning for tomorrow. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the fields that had become more productive with each passing month under their joint care. "Jackson," Eleanor said as they paused by the apple orchard where the trees were heavy with small, developing fruit. "Do you remember what you said to me that night in December? About wanting a real marriage?" Jackson's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her against his side. "I remember every word," he replied. "Best decision I ever made, telling you how I felt." Eleanor leaned into his embrace, gathering her courage. I believe our marriage is about to become even more real." She turned to face him fully. "I'm carrying your child." Jackson stared at her for a long moment, his expression frozen in disbelief. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it with a joy so pure it made Eleanor's heart swell. "A baby," he whispered, his hand moving to rest gently against her still flat stomach. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without the doctor's confirmation," Eleanor replied, covering his hand with her own. "I've been feeling different for a few weeks now." Without warning, Jackson lifted her off her feet in a gentle embrace, spinning her once before carefully setting her down again. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have made me the happiest man in Texas, twice now." "Twice?" she asked, confused. "The first time was when you accepted my ridiculous proposal in the middle of Main Street," he explained, cupping her face in his hands. "The second is right now." As he bent to kiss her, Eleanor felt the perfect rightness of this moment, of their life together. What had begun in public humiliation and desperate improvisation had grown into something beautiful and lasting. That Sunday, they attended church in Johnson City as usual. Eleanor noticed several glances toward her midsection, suggesting that word of her condition had already spread through the town's efficient gossip network. But where once such attention would have made her shrink with discomfort, now she held her head high, Jackson's hand steady at her back. After the service, Reverend Phillips approached them on the church steps. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," he greeted them, his manner considerably warmer than it had been a year ago. "I understand congratulations are in order." "Thank you, Reverend," Jackson replied, his pride evident in his voice. "We're very blessed." The Reverend nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I reluctantly performed your ceremony last year, I had serious doubts about the foundation of your union." He glanced between them. I'm pleased to see that I was mistaken. God works in mysterious ways indeed." "He does," Eleanor agreed, thinking of the unlikely path that had brought her and Jackson together. Sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most perfect outcomes. As they drove home in their wagon, the summer sun warm overhead, Eleanor leaned against Jackson's shoulder, contentment filling her heart. "You ever think about that day?" she asked. "When you rode into Johnson City and found yourself proposing to a complete stranger within the hour?" Jackson chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her ear. "Only every day," he admitted. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd taken the northern road that morning instead of coming through Johnson City." "I'd probably have lost the farm," Eleanor said soberly. "Or been forced to marry someone like Thomas Jenkins who had been circling like a vulture." Jackson's arm tightened around her. "Well, I did take the southern road, and I did ride into Johnson City at exactly the right moment." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Some might call it luck. I call it destiny." Eleanor smiled at the uncharacteristic romanticism from her practical husband. "Either way, I'm grateful. For you, for our farm, for our baby on the way." She paused, her hand resting on her stomach where their child was growing. "When I was standing in that street, facing the mayor and the reverend and feeling so alone, I could never have imagined this would be my life a year later." "Sometimes the best things come from the most difficult moments," Jackson observed. "Without their public shaming, we might never have found each other." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. The very public humiliation that had been meant to force her into submission had instead led her to a partnership based on mutual respect and love, and to a man who valued her strength rather than seeking to diminish it. As their farm came into view, the fields green and thriving despite the continuing drought, Eleanor felt a surge of pride in what they had built together. This land that had been her father's legacy had become the foundation for their shared future. "What shall we name the baby?" she asked as Jackson helped her down from the wagon. He considered for a moment. "If it's a boy, perhaps after your father." "What was his name?" "William," Eleanor replied, touched by the suggestion. "William Hayes," Jackson tested the name. "It has a good sound to it. And if it's a girl?" Eleanor prompted. Jackson's expression softened. "What about Hope? Because that's what she'll represent, the hope that brought us together, the hope we've built our life on." "Hope Hayes," Eleanor repeated, loving the sound of it. "Perfect." As they walked hand in hand toward the house that had become truly their home, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. From public shame to private joy, from a marriage of convenience to a union of love, their story was unconventional by any measure. But then, Eleanor thought as Jackson's hand tightened around hers, the most beautiful stories often were. 7 months later, on a crisp January morning, Eleanor gave birth to twins, a boy they named William and a girl they called Hope. The news spread quickly through Johnson City, and despite the winter chill, visitors came bearing gifts and good wishes for the Hayes family. Among them was Mayor Thompson, who arrived with his wife bearing a handcrafted cradle. "My own contribution," he said somewhat awkwardly as Jackson invited them in. "I've taken up woodworking in my spare time." "It's beautiful," Eleanor said sincerely from where she sat by the fire, a baby in each arm. "Thank you." The mayor shuffled his feet, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "I feel I owe you both an apology," he said finally. "My concerns about your property were not entirely motivated by community welfare." "We know," Jackson replied evenly. "The railroad." Mayor Thompson nodded. "The line will pass within a mile of your southern border. Land values have already tripled in anticipation." He glanced at Eleanor. "Your father chose well when he purchased this property. He had foresight." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "He did." There was an awkward silence, then Mrs. Thompson stepped forward to admire the babies. "They're beautiful," she said warmly. "Johnson City is blessed to have such a fine family among its citizens." After they had gone, Eleanor looked up at Jackson with a bemused expression. Was that an apology? "As close as Thomas Thompson will ever come to one," Jackson replied with a chuckle, sitting beside her and gently taking William into his arms. "But I'll accept it." As the twins grew, so did the prosperity of the Hayes farm. The railroad's arrival brought new markets for their crops, and Jackson's innovative farming methods continued to yield harvests that exceeded their neighbors. They added a wing to the house, planted an expanded orchard, and built a new barn that became a gathering place for community barn dances and harvest celebrations. On the twins' 5th birthday, as they watched their children playing in the yard with the other youngsters from neighboring farms, Eleanor leaned against Jackson's shoulder. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is our life," she murmured. "All of this from that moment in the street when you decided to propose to a complete stranger." Jackson's arm tightened around her waist. "Best impulsive decision I ever made," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I'm not sure it was entirely impulsive." Eleanor looked up at him questioningly. "I remember riding into town and seeing you standing there, facing down the mayor and reverend with your head high despite their efforts to shame you," Jackson explained, his voice soft with memory. "And I thought, there's a woman who doesn't break." In that moment, before I even dismounted from my horse, something in me recognized something in you. "And what was that?" Eleanor asked, touched by the unexpected revelation. Jackson considered for a moment. "A kindred spirit, perhaps. Someone who understood what it meant to stand alone against expectations. Someone who valued independence but longed for partnership." He smiled down at her. "Someone worth building a life with." Eleanor stood on tiptoe to kiss him, still marveling after 6 years at the depth of feeling between them. "I'm glad you recognized it," she said, "even if I took a little longer to see it myself." "Worth the wait," Jackson assured her, his eyes crinkling with the smile that still made her heart skip. From across the yard, William called out, "Pa, come see what I built." "Duty calls," Jackson said with a grin, releasing Eleanor to join their son. Eleanor watched as her husband crouched beside William, examining the small structure the boy had created from sticks and twine. Hope soon joined them, her dark hair so like Jackson's escaping from its braids as she eagerly added her own contributions to her brother's project. The scene before her, her family, their home, the prosperous farm stretching out around them, represented everything Eleanor had fought to preserve, and more than she had ever dared hope for. From the darkest moment of public humiliation had come the greatest joy of her life. As Jackson looked up and caught her watching, his smile warm with love and shared understanding, Eleanor felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them together. What had begun as an arrangement of necessity had blossomed into a love story. Neither could have anticipated proof that sometimes, even in the wild uncertainty of the Texas frontier, life's most painful moments could lead to its greatest blessings. And as she moved to join her family, Eleanor Walsh Hayes knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't change a single step of the journey that had led her here to this home, this land, this man who had become her true partner in every sense of the word. For in the end, it wasn't the town's approval or the farm's prosperity that defined their success. It was the love they had built together, day by day, choice by choice, a love that had transformed two strangers into a family, and a hasty proposal in a dusty street into a lifetime of shared dreams.